Hello. Uh, okay. Hello. We are Project House in Patrick Schumacher Studio, and we are Victor, Daniel, Maha, and me, Kareem. Beginning first to question system design versus systems design, architecture always dealt with the regulation of building systems, such as structure and infrastructure, yet often juxtaposed in inconsistent separate ways. Richard Hamilton's What Makes Today's Homes Appealing poses the question, what makes a house? Le Corbusier and Maison Domino abstracted to structure, while Reynald Banel abstracted to infrastructure. Nature, on the other hand, gives us a good example of how this different systems can be multifunctional and juxtaposed in the performative. As water goes through stems, it gives both structural integrity to the system and keeps it alive. Buckminster Fuller tried to bridge this gap with his Dymaxion house, but he also extends the conversation to car as part of the house. And in Archigram's examples of Walking City and the Living Pod, they push it to the extreme where the mobility becomes the inhabitable. So all this leads to our thesis in which we're trying to research this new house vehicle prototype that incorporates structure and infrastructure together into a monocoque system that allows to perform the multifunctionality and rendering spaces more smooth. So the house becomes in the monocoque, spaces are more organs of this monocoque, serrated space, smooth space, and structure is incentive. Our research is divided down to three main categories. First, the macro scale, which deals with the generative process and the formation of the surface for the monocoque. Second, the micro scale, which focuses on the design of the monocoque itself. And third, the fabrication.
To set the testing ground for the project and having in mind the idea of proposing a design system that could be tested in multiple sites, we selected 5 different locations spread across London's canals. We analyzed the constraints and possibilities that each of them provided, focusing the observation in 5 main aspects: their limits, possible facades, entrances, height, and orientation. We then selected one as a main testing ground for the project, located in Camden and providing access both from street and canal.
Starting with the Maison Domino as an experimentation for structural exploration, we tested the model for both deformation and materialization, breaking down the staticness of the original 6 columns, and a more optimized solution is reached, which was a non-uniform arrangement. The model was then tested with branching systems and linear support systems as walls to give more space definition and less deformation and more material utilization. Yet the mapping of these different successful iterations showed that there is a threshold before structural failure, giving the chance for incorporating other building systems without compromising the structural integrity. In this extreme example, the structure moves from one position to the other according to the iterations and their effect on the system. This allows for incorporating other multidisciplinary systems. Starting with the macro scale, we begin with the generative process and generating of form. The generative process reacts directly to site and space. So starting with the site, it reacts to first plot shape and size, which then defines space volumes and ratios. Second, neighboring structures and the regions to avoid. And third, entry points, height considerations, and focal points such as vistas and water fronts. On the other hand, space is divided down according to hierarchy of public and private, but more importantly, how they relate to each other in regard to circulation, achieving a loop circulation that is part of the space and it becomes more spatial, in contrast to another separate technical system attached as in the Maison Domino. Once established, the different rule sets are fed into an algorithmic solver that are here, that in these 2 examples on different sites shows how they can adapt to them. So the different iterations shown are the result of these 3 different sites chosen for the experimentation and how they add the clear reaction to the different constraints. In this example especially, height was the main influence, and here are different stills showing in 12, 14, and 17 meters. Focusing on the Camden site which shows, the system is then tested in regard to first circulation and how the arrangement of surfaces can arrange around the high and low point to maintain also a loop for the fluids throughout. In generating the preliminary surface for the monocoque composite, an efficient form that would allow for better efficiency in regard to infrastructure and structure was required. Looking at minimal surfaces proved hard due to their symmetry, so voxelizing the in-between space and relaxing it achieves this minimal-like condition, but also the freedom to design different forms. Breaking down the voxel system, it's resulted of 3 different considerations. First, structure, the circulation routes, and the interspatial space. Finally, the mesh iterations in each site. Mesh relaxation are anchor points are reaction to the site considerations, they later allow for inside and outside interaction. A selected mesh for the site is then broken down to sections and plans to begin to understand and analyze the spaces provided. Yet it also showed that it requires the mesh to be subjected to different performative refinement aspects, such as heights and space, that will be discussed in the next part. And here's just a catalog to show the different spatial characteristics generated. In scan development, a number of trials were carried out in reaction to the inner volume, using first the regular forms of space, then moving to metaballs in the next row, which are clearly a failure in relating to the inner volume, but finally shrink wrapping a surface onto the skin onto the surface, which uses the top plates as anchor points and extruded parts of the original mesh. This creates a flexible field around that can be used then for openings and perforations.
In order to set the rules for the design process for the vehicle in a similar manner to the one proposed for the house, we decided to take Ferrari as a reference in terms of dimensions and aerodynamics by analyzing the change of their design lines throughout time. The second point was to find an equivalent for the car of what the program represents for the house. In this sense, we abstracted the car into four main components: the powertrain, dashboard, cockpit, and engine. These main aspects, dimensions, aerodynamics, and main components, create the base rules for the generative process. By changing their size, shape, and position, and observing the intersection between all elements, we were able to generate multiple voxel arrangements that, through a mesh relaxation process, resulted in different lightweight vehicle skeletons. We selected two results for further development, and by tweaking the process, we were able to generate full families of iterations with different levels of detail. These two catalogs show in detail the refinement process applied for both families, in which were considered resistance, arrangement of main elements, and also an aesthetic evaluation. The initial proposal for the vehicle skin is based on a wrapping logic, again in a similar manner to the one proposed for the house, and in the process, the skeleton is responsible for giving shape to the car, while the material that wraps it up is responsible for its translucency. The result of the combination of soft and rigid structures generated a concept in which the variable cross-section throughout the object shows the close integration of two different geometries that are respectively rigid and soft, opaque and translucent.
Moving to the next part of the macro scale, which is the performative, it's divided down to network and structure optimization and design articulation, which relate to space, circulation, and interface. Starting with the network generation and focusing now on structure optimization, we take part of the house to first test out how can we understand the different forces. So testing the sector, we understand the loads as the main walkable areas, while the connections are the main support points, the connection of this sector to the other house. We localize the mesh and allow for topology optimization to understand where forces flow and also where material utilization is. Analyzing the sector again for compression lines, it begins to refine our understanding of how force propagates throughout the surface. And finally, on the full scale of the house, showing which parts are material utilized and the force flow.
The aim from the previous structural analysis is to articulate reinforcing channels that would run across the inner and outer structure. These channels are not to be thought as only structurally reinforcing elements, but also potential infrastructural elements. The initial setup consisted of treating these structures as a vector field, where particles emit and would flow within its bounds. However, the vector field requires additional input to demonstrate that we have control over how these channels organize. The first level of control that we attained is by having the vector field respond to a curve. The second method involved introducing weight maps that would determine where these particles are emitted. By using these two setups, we then factored in the structural analysis that would represent principal compression lines, while the weight map would represent regions of high concentration loads. We then ran the simulation on a sector of the house. So the setup for the inner structure differs to that of the outer due to the fact that the inner is undergoing compressive forces while the outer is withstanding tensile forces. And in terms of the outer structure, Curves here represent as anchors between the skin and the inner structure, and they also indicate where there's a change in curvature. The weight map here are not based on the structural analysis, but rather in terms of affording opportunities for opening. And over here, you can see the orchestration of the entire setup. The simulation is then translated into geometry, where the channels are hollow and superimposed onto the inner structure.
We then moved into the house refinement, taking into consideration the constraints of circulation, space, and interstitial pods. Instead of a concentrated vertical circulation, the main routes are based in a loop, which allow continuous movement throughout different spaces inside the house. And in order to articulate the geometry, we made several tests on how to fuse steps into the surfaces and use them for other functions such as seating and shelves. The circulation diagram shows how the house is divided in multiple levels, going from street access to canal level and passing by upper levels and vehicle docking points.
Moving on to the interspatial pods, 3 main regions are defined and are broken down internally to a number of spaces and infrastructural compartments. So each pod would have a common space and then less public space and more private, and then network part and infrastructure parts that would house the mechanisms. Different design iterations of the pods show how circulation then acts more as a spatial element that can incorporate furniture and definition of space. And here are the 3 pods in a section to show the different relations, and how we can take one pod of these and show different iterations inside to create more spatial adjustments.
Regarding the plan organization, we can see how all the main spaces are visually connected, creating a clear differentiation between inner and outer areas. The outer areas are related to living spaces, while the inner ones are related to service, with the potential to allocate wet areas such as swimming pool, sauna, kitchen, and bathrooms. In the sections, we can see how there is a visual connection between the entrance and the canal, creating a sense of continuity and a smooth space. At the same time, it's again evident that the dichotomy between inner and outer areas. The house intends to be a semi-private sequence of spaces where the facade becomes a translucent veil. The different degrees of transparency combined with the infrastructure channels are shown all around the house. This interior view of the house shows how transparency and smoothness of material enables the creation of a lightness feeling. The intricacy of the infrastructure channels, blurred and embedded into the building, can then contribute to flexibility and space articulation.
In regards to the car, after the selection of one of the iterations from the generative process, the refinement of the design was focused on 3 main aspects: the reinterpretation of the cockpit, the movement from a skin-skeleton relation into the idea of a composite, and its interface with the house. We started by analyzing the current scenario in vehicle design with its limited cockpit area and confined driving position. And the selected skeleton iteration presented certain scale issues that highlighted this problem, as well as a traditional approach towards the idea of a frame. At the same time, the initial combination of both skin and skeleton created a separation between both geometries, an issue that we also intended to tackle during the next steps of the design. Taking all the previous issues into consideration, we started the refinement process, aiming to 1, adjust shape and proportion to adequate it in terms of ground relation and ergonomics. 2, move from the separation between skin and skeleton into a hybrid between both that resembles the house idea of composite. And 3, reinterpret the cockpit by enlarging its area and moving away from the limited and confined driving position into a new social space. The first result of the design refinement already shows a new proposal in terms of scale, while it respects the main design lines obtained from the generative process. It is also possible to see, when compared to the initial section, how skin and skeleton are now part of the same composite strategy, which leaves behind the traditional ideas of vehicle body frame and its covering possibilities. The latest iteration combines all the ideas previously mentioned and highlights the new cockpit as a focal point of the proposal. At the same time, it reflects other aspects also present in the house design, such as the different degrees of transparency. This section shows our new proposed ratio for the human space in regards to the mechanical areas. The cockpit goes now into the front of the car, facilitating the direct integration with the house, while its battery and other mechanical elements stay condensed in a smaller area. In order to explore the potential occupation of this new enlarged cockpit, we proposed it for different situations. The car can become, to mention a few, a continuation of a living space, a control center for the house, or either a mobile working station for days of busy traffic, all depending on the user needs. To allow its full integration with the house, we proposed an opening system based on 8 panels. A main seam on the top of the vehicle divides it in 2 sides, allowing a folding logic to happen, in which panels 1 and 2 first move into position, and then follow the movement of panels 3 and 4, creating a total aperture for the cockpit area. To conclude, the wheel system is made of 4 rings that work as 3. The 2 wheels on the back are larger, helping stability, and they also allow side movement similar to the one of a motorbike and increasing the range of movements. The front wheels have a joint which allow a rotational movement that hide it once it's plugged into the house and also work as a locking system. The intentions for the interface between house and car are based on 3 main aspects. First, their fusion and continuous transition, which is facilitated from the similar generative design strategy applied for both. Second, the dichotomy between social space and service space, which is also present in both. And third, the possibilities of infrastructure sharing. With these 3 goals in mind, we propose a docking point for the car, which guarantees the alignment between cockpit and house floor and locks the car in position. At the same time, the space is fused accordingly. While the mechanic parts of the car stay confined under service areas, the social cockpit, now fully open, becomes an extension of the living spaces. This logic enables the exploration of potential uses for the cockpit, such as furniture continuation, control center of the house, and at the same time creates opportunity for basic infrastructure sharing, such as, for example, charging, lighting, and sound.
By addressing the issue of fabrication, it is necessary to take into consideration not only production methods, but also dimensions, transportation, and assembly logic. The production model we are proposing starts with the digital design of the house, where it is broken into chunks which are individually produced, transported, and assembled on site. The process followed to develop the system starts by making a study of the surfaces and placing the cutting lines. Secondly, the study of the connection between chunks, and finally, fabrication, as in materiality and production. In order to build a house in a 1-to-N scale, we propose the use of FRP and reinforced fiberglass for the paneling of the inner and outer surfaces, since this material could replicate the intended qualities for the project, such as transparency and lightness. We also see potential in the use of large-scale 3D printers to produce the rigid connections and channels, and a digital bed that could create the shape of each specific part, reusable and flexible enough to create all the shapes and small corrugations. Following the information given by the structural analysis and topology optimization, we found the areas where there is less stress and consequently where the cuts would preferably be placed. We proposed then a division method in which the house can be broken into chunks. As a tree, the house is interpreted within a gradient where the cores become the rigid connection to the ground, and the further the chunks are from the cores, the lighter they become. The chunk catalog shows the proposed differentiation between pieces divided into stairs, columns, connections, and spaces. An opportunity for customization is then created, allowing the detailing of specific chunks for different areas of the house. In the prototype scale, we did several experiments where we were focusing on the degree of control that we can achieve with different materials and molds, as well as the best way to get flat and smooth layers. The main materials used were polyester resin, silicone, and fiberglass. We also did some studies to alter the pieces and get different degrees of transparency, being able to identify the main material constraints in order to design the chunks. By analyzing the previous experiment, we realized that the best way to achieve a closer result to what was intended in the design was to combine plastic and resin. In this prototype, we can see how connections between chunks and infrastructure channels could be embedded into a translucent piece, generating texture and corrugation on the underside and smoothness in the top layer. We took half of the house to explain the chunk logic, and we proposed 3 kinds of connection relating to facade, slab, and columns, all of them male-female joints secured with rivets, with thin seams in between the pieces. The connections are always embedded in the rigid part of the chunk and are in charge of transferring the loads from one chunk to another.
And finally, on the microscale, focusing on the monocoque system, the previously generated network thus presents the potential of incorporating the different infrastructural services, like the traditional services, into a hierarchy of connected loops. In this chunk, detail, the structural pattern clearly shows how channels are infused, maintaining both structural integrity and infrastructural multifunctionality. And finally, in this final view, it shows how an example of an inner pod with the network clearly visible behind while housing the main services and the wet areas. Thank you. So here we have, is it on? So here we have the different site iterations and how we experimented the generative process in different sites and different considerations. And then the full prototype of the house chosen to be articulated. And here, the different experimentations for the car and the house to reach the final forms. Testing how the, okay. Testing the, here, for example, the skin development and how it wraps around the inner volume. Section development, finally the car, which is sliced for you can even to pick it up and see how the details inside are refined. And finally, the material testing and all the prototypes for the chunk and the monocoque and how it can be used for infrastructural infusion. Thank you.
Okay. I think it's amazing to see this project now under the light of yesterday's lecture. Beautiful, in a way, this house that we saw with sun rays and optimizing the kind of internal logic, and beautiful how this connects to this kind of work. What I like very much about the project is the kind of control that there is in the spatial organization and in the tectonics, actually, of the parts coming together, and this understanding of this monocoque kind of surface. I really appreciate to see, in a way, how the project has been worked out. Maybe two little comments with all the appreciation. The one thing that I think does not do you any service is this blurry, kind of misty renderings. And I say that because all the control on the geometry and all the kind of rigor that there is behind the work somehow gets evaporated in these images. And I really think that this is not the same kind of language or the same kind of rigorous, I say, expression for the project. I don't know. That's one thing. And then maybe the second one has to do with, and I think it's maybe because I'm sitting in front of this section, but I find when you actually section the thickness of this membrane, that you could productively use these holes and these cavities for eventually programmatic opportunities. And what happens is that when the space is all smoothened out and you see all continuous, and you are basically missing that pocket space that could potentially do something else. But I don't see it. I see it only as a section always. It's all the wet space. Yeah, I think that the size of these pockets could be very differentiated depending on how you use it, as cardboard space, or So I think that the project has all the ingredients for me to make it even more complex and even more. Infrastructural, I would say. And I really like how the car goes into the house, and that really there is a kind of a dialogue between the car and the house.
I would agree. I think it's a lovely project, and all I would like to see is a little bit more. I know that a lot of the original thoughts in the definition of the house came from defining the spaces within and the light requirements, and then trying to conceal the infrastructure for the building within that, which is great. It gives this wonderful surface, which obviously is lost a little in the mist at times, but it can be seen in some of the images and does come across very well. But there's features within there that where you would have taps in the walls, where you would have all these things that the concealed infrastructure could give you much more elegantly than sometimes it's expressed in current building design. And that's something that is an opportunity that's missed by not going into some of the detail on those things.
I mean, there have been several kind of comments of a certain order, so I'll take a kind of slightly different tack. It's really, you know, you start where the word is house, and let's assume that has a kind of reference to what you started with. What happens to the word house during the process of your transformation? I mean, do you think, you know, all the relations are changing, but you haven't yet changed the relationship between the name and the object? And I'm wondering, because I think it may seem a small point, but in a sense, it projects into quite a large point as to the characterization of what you're doing.
I think we started from these two main points, which was the Mason Domino and Reina Banham's diagram of what makes a house. So one argued for this abstract structure and one argued for this abstract infrastructure. And actually the infusion of both, as in the painting by Richard Hamilton, is what makes the house inhabitable. So that's why we chose even the name house for the project, because it's a new prototype for this new house that actually allows for this inhabitability to happen without compromising either structure or infrastructure.
I mean, I feel that that's a very articulate kind of response, but I'm not sure it's a response to me. I mean, could I just kind of push it a little bit? Because upon it depends really the architectural description of what you've done, rather than a sequence of the actions or events which you've got there. I mean, it's as if you need to now run through it, describing it in architectural terms. Because I'm not quite sure what the status of the terms that you use have. That's why, you know, it makes sense to call architecture something of a discourse or a discipline or something, because within it now, you may well have gone off and done something, but you also kind of bring it back. And so I'm asking you, and I'm partly asking you because, you know, if you go a bit further, you know, perhaps the house, and perhaps it's not accidental that you've ended up here, the house in some sense is the black hole of architecture. I mean, in the sense that I'm not sure the house is a thing. I'm not sure that it has like a referent. I'm pretty sure that since the 19th century that when we start using the word housing, that sort of marks the place after which you don't have a house. But it's problematic because almost all the architects I can think of, when they want to show you they're also a really good architect, as well as the intellectual achievement they have, they'll show you, like you know, a series of houses. So you're starting from a terribly knotted, architecturally knotted object. And I'm trying to kind of see in any sense whether that's elucidated by the transformations you've made, or which you now tell me.
I think, like, if we're gonna discuss the word house in general, like, it could be just a shelter, like, above someone's head. But in the end, what we felt that what's like taking us behind in the architecture of housing is that it's limited by the systems. And we were more towards the Rainer Banham kind of model, because he said that you can just like take a space and make it a house for yourself as long as you're able to live there. So we tried somehow through these interspatial pods to create this adaptability that it's always there around you somewhere, so you're not confined by something. And in architectural terms, I guess it's just a kind of a smooth space that we want to incorporate in the thing. In contrast to Maison Domino, which is really like separated by levels, separated by circulation, separated by the systems. It's you become not like the main incentive for the house architecture, but instead you're just a subsidiary organ.
I'm kind of, I guess, somewhat touched, but a bit perplexed that someone from the DRL is describing a house as shelter. I'd have thought anyone from the DRL who used the word shelter would be taken out and sheltered for the rest of their life. I mean, I don't think you want to go that way. Patrick?
I think the way the Maison Domino was picked up was not so much in its capacity as a house, meaning a residence, an individual villa residence, although in the end that's what we're also having here. But I think what the Maison Domino, as well as the early 1920s villas, including Villa Savoie, represent, there are manifesto projects modeled, which are generalizable into the totality of tasks which are post-architecture through the built environment of the 21st century industrial mass mechanization society, if you like. And it was a system and an approach to technology, to production, which had consequences for the artistic registers, seriality, separation, generic repetition, etc. And I think in that contrast, we need to see that. But we also want to see it all the way to the phenomenology. And I'm very happy and interested that in the end, we see that dematerialization, to some extent, which started in the 20th century, is kind of radicalized and pushed forward. We could go in and weigh these and see that kind of lightness, but most strikingly, the complexity of adaptive differentiation to site conditions. That's very important, that you have a series of sites and this kind of variation and adaptation. The system integration versus the system separation and system autonomy. The use, and of course, of computational capacities to give increased adaptive, differentiative intelligence to the system, nature-like, which in a sense in modernism was kind of, to some extent, even a reduction of intelligence, which was the vernacular evolutionary processes, which had to spare material and adapt to topography and climate, and modernism allowed that to be kind of machined out of the system. It's kind of regained. So these are the themes. Admittedly, and although it could have been a fact, the next layer would be what are the social processes, if you go then to say this is the methodology of us as generic system statement, but also what are these villas and houses say about the cultural processes and how does one live, how a family diagram constructed. We didn't go there, but that could be another stage and element.
Yeah, perhaps I shouldn't speak because I only just came and I cannot even stay for long. So, but as a footnote to what I seem to understand is the spirit of the game, in the 20s, Le Corbusier was fascinated by the logic of mass production, which was so successful in the automobile, and he said, since we can mass produce automobiles so well to achieve economies of scale, we should standardize housing in the same way, which he did. It was at the time a good idea. Today, the logic is reversed. We start to mass customize housing using parametric tools 20 years ago. We started it, not the car industry, and now the car industry may or may not be following. The pattern is reversed. 100 years ago, the automobile invented the assembly line, and the architect said we should do the same. Today, we invented digital mass customization for building. And now we think that the car industry may be following our example, but are they? Even in what you have been doing, you adapt and you adopt and you intelligently exploit digital parametricism in your building. Then you use the same parametric tools to design an automobile. But my suspicion is that when you have designed that parametric automobile, you may still need an assembly line to make 1 billion identical copies of it. Is this what you have in mind? And if not, do you see an alternative to that? I don't know the answer, of course, which is why I'm asking.
Customization became a huge part in regard to everything in our lives. So to have your own custom house for your own custom site, to have your own custom car for your own house, maybe be an appealing idea for the people nowadays. Like, we tend to customize everything, and we're selling every product from apps to clothing to everything through customization. So there's a tendency out there.
Do you think the car industry is going to allow, for example, Mercedes will allow you to customize the car you're buying on the screen before it is printed out? Do you think that is going to happen? Because we have been saying that for 20 years, but it is still not happening. And they start to suspect that it may never happen.
Yeah. I think there was something that Mark, though, touched on, which is kind of important, because if the conversation still treats the vehicle holistically and treats the notion of home holistically, then I think this notion of these two end states hasn't changed the game at all. I think one way to approach Mark's question, which I think is an important one for you guys to interrogate, is that the project also has transitional states, intermediate states, and particularly between what was very much understood as the public and the private domain. When these cars now unfold themselves into interiors, if you've achieved it or not in terms of the interrogation is something that you should explore about how much of that interiority begins to surface in the public domain of mobility machines, a reconstitution of the notion of machine for living, which in one sense was just taking a kind of footnote of production and sort of us bringing that into a kind of domesticated way of living. And now if we are trying to look at these kind of transformational things, is to really understand that in between these states lies, I think, the opportunity to redefine actually the notion of what these kind of environments actually offer, and that the fact that they're not domesticated within the house as only being the expression of experimentation within architecture, and the vehicle and all of these other aspects, like the house as a mobility machine, the vehicle as being actually a form of shelter, or whatever you want to constitute in terms of reference. I think it's this in-between, between these two very kind of clearly understood 100 years and running, that have to be sort of redefined. And I think Mark's point, in a very elegant way, kind of teases that down because it problematizes the whole notion of the terms of reference and the necessity, I think, for the students to actually understand that there's a lot at stake by this kind of plugging in of a system that's going to be beyond actually services and infrastructure that Banham was talking about, and I think beyond, let's say, just the whole notion of the domestic, which I think is very fundamental. If these things will start to function more as urban prototypes and ways of actually reconsidering our relationship to them, and particularly when we're sort of evolving kind of discourses of shared and participation, those things also then start to qualify actually what is the new social scenarios that are a part of this conversation. Because I think that is part of the evolving discourse that goes beyond the methods that we use to generate. And it's part of this kind of evolution that goes beyond computation and becomes a form of practice in the way that we live.
Maybe after this, I would also want to add some positive comment towards the car more and motivate you to think further in that direction. Because I think, the car was, before it was drawn as an object, it was defined through parameters such as the Volkswagen 75 years ago, for example, 4 seats, gas saving, 75% of the GDP per capita should cost, and 100 kilometers per hour. Somebody had to drive on the highways. I think these parameters, we experience a total paradigm shift right now if we agree that we are in an urban environment at the moment. And I think there were some really good attempts from your side in that direction. And for example, the decoupling of functions, such as there's the cockpit, which is a cabin. You're not actively driving anymore, I guess, in the future. And the idea of decoupling it and sharing infrastructure. You even mentioned a canal. Why is, so the redefinition of what a car really is it a capsule that is maybe attached to multiple prime movers? One is floating on a river, the other is, shared on the street. So there were a couple of ideas, and I think, there could be maybe enforced more in the next couple of weeks in that direction. It was good to see.
In fact, the brief also was calling for, although it hasn't been picked up, although it was started to work on a boat. And I live along this canal, and I was fascinated by all the houseboats, a lot of people living in these boats. And some of them, lock right in front of these villas. They're different owners, but it spawns the idea of breaking up that unity of house as a fixed location, and had fragments, locking in, locking out, and having different components in that kind of assemblage logic, which I think is which is nicely solved here as well, in a similar way, the way the kind of distinction of serviced and servicing elements which are in the car lock into that, in the respective systems in the house. And I think that was a very nice way to integrate that, and then when activate the house and have key systems which we personally own, now transported with us, with our cars, some of them in our pockets by now. And in a sense, the coming and going of the owner and its activation and transformation that implies, I think is quite nice, really represented, and the boat was the other element. But also I like what you're saying, this kind of separating of the mobility element from the cabin, which is smoothed around. And previous projects we also had this nice, locking and fusion of various vehicles, and it's a little bit on a more articulate and less free way, also discussing issues of body plan transformation and assemblage and nearly kind of collective organism. These were the kind of underlying discussions we also had at the root of the original brainstorming in this project. So there's, even though it's very, very different in the final outcome, there is a shared kind of attitudinal register with some of the other projects, which are, of course, far more, let's say, radical in their transformative approach. Whereas this one is aiming for kind of comparability and lineage, continuity, cumulative transformation, which at some point, yes, quantitative spins into qualitative, and there's also very new qualities here. But that lineage and continuity is interesting to me. What is the 21st century out of the 20th century?
From my end, what I see as the strength of the project is the way it conceives of a material organization in relation to space, and to do with the idea of mass customization for production. So, when you start to deal with very almost like composite materials, these types of things, and we start to see at least two materials interfacing with each other, and we see this being globally evaluated in different software processes like structural analysis, but then being broken into parts, I think you start to articulate a very interesting visual continuity that relates to the space, but at the same time, the fabrication is something altogether different. And this is a position you take that would be, say, very different from Corbusier in terms of Ville-Savoie or Maison Domino. And it starts to suggest something much more malleable, and you're not even sure at times whether the parts are expressed or not. Like in general, the renders suggest they're not expressed, but definitely there's an articulation at a much smaller scale that is keeping all the parts together. And I think this works actually really well when you start to see some of the close-up images and diagrams. Where I become a little bit to question this, or where I think it could go further, is when you start looking at the boundary. Because the boundary, if we really are working with mass customization, we could be much more tailored towards the site condition. You know, for instance, the canal doesn't really feature much in the project. And it would be nice to see how you could actually anticipate where you could maybe kind of, let's say, project into other sites, neighbors' sites. Or as a theoretical project, it doesn't have to necessarily respect the site boundary so religiously, I would say. And the actual, when you see the roof as well, like that's definitely an opportunity there for skylights, roof terraces. You know, even Corbusier had a lot of solariums and things on the rooftop. I just think there's an opportunity in the next couple of weeks that you rethink of the envelope and of the roof in particular and the interface for the canal, because these things really could also be bespoke. And yeah, I would say there needs to be more argument for let's say the qualities that that you can achieve through the bespoke production, because at the moment we have some interesting spaces, but it could actually be on any site. And part of that mass customization surely addresses site.